Thank you, Rhonda, and everybody at the Coalition for the Homeless. Can everybody hear me okay? Just want to make sure I'm not muted anymore. So we are going to talk through housing infrastructure bonds, and specifically going big. So our mission at Minnesota Housing is that housing is the foundation for success. So we collaborate with individuals, communities, and partners to create, preserve, and finance affordable housing. So what we'll talk about today, we'll talk through kind of the background of housing infrastructure bonds. We'll walk through some of the legislative process and the history around them. And then we'll talk through how they're actually used to finance affordable housing around the state. And then we'll have some of the specific examples of projects that we've funded in the past few years. And then there's a Q&A, and as Rhonda mentioned, that Q&A I think is available throughout, and we'll do our best to monitor that. So what is HIB when you hear that acronym used? HIB stands for Housing Infrastructure Bonds, and I thought it would be helpful if we kind of backed up one step even before that, and we just talked about what is bonding. So bonding, or as you may hear it referred to around the legislature as capital investment, is borrowing. So the state uses its credit to borrow money to build and maintain the state's publicly owned fixed assets. So the Constitution of the state actually requires it be for a public purpose. And most of the types of bonds that are out there require public ownership of these fixed assets. So these are things like buildings on university campuses, convention centers, state parks, arenas. The state capitol was the preservation for that was funded through bonds over the past, and a little bit of cash since the state was in pretty good financial situation. But so it's essentially the state borrows money. We say we have this, we need cash for this project, and the state goes out and sells those bonds, raises the cash, and then we pay that back over time with interest. Typically 20 years is the period of those bonds. So a housing infrastructure bond is a type of bond, though it's a little bit different than the other types of bonds that you may have heard of or be familiar with. So there's what's called general obligation bonds, which, if we're going to get very technical here, those are backed by the full faith and credit of the state of Minnesota, meaning that if the state were to ever not be able to pay back those bonds, what we refer to as the debt service, the state could actually levy a special property tax in order to raise the money to be able to pay for that. So housing infrastructure bonds are a little different in that the legislature actually has to authorize a standing appropriation for those bonds. So if you were to actually look at our statute for Minnesota housing, I think it's 462A.37. That's the housing infrastructure bond statute. And you'll see in that listed that every year that we have an authorization, going back to 2012, it says you are authorized to issue this amount, meaning sell this amount of bonds, and then we'll pay that back over the period of the next 20 years. So these bonds, since they are issued by a standing appropriation or authorized by a standing appropriation, the legislature can actually reduce or repeal that appropriation at any time. These bonds are also subject to unallotment by the governor, meaning the governor, when he goes through a spending bill that's passed by the legislature, he can actually remove specific portions of a bill or do that in whole or partially as well. So that's a little bit of a distinction too between this and like a general obligation bond, which you may be familiar with them in the housing world because that's how we preserve publicly owned housing around the state. Those have a little bit, the general obligation bond, since it is backed by the full faith and credit of the state of Minnesota, is a little bit more secure, meaning we can get typically a little bit more favorable interest rate for those. However, it isn't all that much different because both the state and the legislature have done a very good job of repaying their debts over the years. And so that makes these very secure investments for those who want to purchase them. So why do we use housing infrastructure bonds to develop affordable housing in the way that we do versus using a general obligation bond? Well, first of all, it allows for private ownership. That's been a very important piece because we have such a vast and strong network of developers of affordable housing, and then also organizations who are able to provide the services for those. So those organizations often partner with one another to be able to do that. These bonds, housing infrastructure bonds, do an excellent job of leveraging other existing sources of funding. In fact, you know, if you've ever participated in a lobby day, that's one of our main talking points when we're talking to legislators about why these are such a good tool, is that we're able to pull in other various sources of funding, often sources of funding that aren't from the state. So they could be from local units of government, or they could be from the federal government, or they could be private sources of funding. And it's one of many different tools, as you'll see later in the presentation, that we use to develop housing. So we also over the years have added some uses. So it's become a very good tool to develop different types of housing along the continuum. And those are specified in statute. The legislature actually has to approve those new uses, and then it's up to us to implement that. And then we use these housing infrastructure bonds to be able to develop and finance deeply affordable housing. So housing for people who have experienced homelessness, who have very limited assets or income, that the private market just can't or won't do, because the private market has to make money in order to be able to develop housing. And when you're having to provide such deep subsidies in the beginning, it just doesn't always make it, or to be able to charge rents that are affordable to people with very low incomes. You just can't make the numbers work in order to be able to do that without this instrument and of actually a very deep commitment to the mission of affordable housing as well. So just a little bit about how this moves through the legislature, and then I'll get into some of the history of housing infrastructure bonds specifically. So capital investment or bonding bills, they must originate in the House of Representatives, because they do, in theory, raise revenue, and all revenue raising bills have to start in the House. One thing I didn't put on the slide, but I'll just make note of, is that bonding bills are often not subject, or I should say not often, they're one of a handful of different types of bills that aren't subject to the self-imposed committee deadlines that the legislature puts on themselves. So, you know, if you follow kind of the order of a legislative session, they'll have deadlines for when certain things need to happen throughout a legislative session, and a bonding bill can come up at any time. And sometimes they do, because they're often one of the things that happen as part of kind of the grand negotiations that take place between the governor and the legislature in the final weeks of session. Housing infrastructure bonds, because they're an appropriation bond, can pass as a standalone bill with just a simple majority. So that's 68 votes in the House and 34 votes in the Senate. This actually happened fairly recently in the 2019 legislative session during the first special session, with about 3 minutes to go before their deadline of 6 a.m., they passed a standalone bonding bill. General obligation bonds, on the other hand, require a 3/5 vote in both the House and Senate. So that's 81 out of 134 members in the House, and then 41 out of 67 members in the Senate. And you often see what typically happens is that housing infrastructure bonds are lumped in the omnibus capital investment bill along with general obligation bonds, and that's the vast majority of bonding that the state does. So kind of the theoretical path that a bonding bill will take is that it'll be introduced in both the House and the Senate, an identical version. It'll have its first hearing in the House and Senate capital investment committees. On occasion, you'll see other committee chairs, sometimes higher ed committees, for example, will want to hear about, what's in the bill for University of Minnesota or, Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. Though that might not be a formal hearing and it might not need to pass. They just want to know what's in it. Even though the housing committees don't technically have jurisdiction over these bonds, it's in the purview of the capital investment committees. We'll often do informal hearings and presentations in the housing committees to talk about what's being recommended for housing infrastructure bonds in a given session. And then it'll go on to House Ways and Means or Senate Finance Committees. They're the ones who kind of oversee the state's finances that are, or the appropriated finances. And then it'll move back to the floor for final passage. And again, that can happen very quickly in the beginning of a legislative session, but often it takes the duration of a legislative session in order for these bills to be passed, because they become part of those negotiations that happen at the end in order to conclude a legislative session. So kind of the very early history of housing infrastructure bonds, if you'll step back in time with me to almost a decade ago now. So in the 2011 legislative session, there was a $5 billion deficit in the upcoming biennium. And we had divided government. Some of this may be sounding familiar, of what we're about to step into. At the end of that session, they could not get an agreement. They ended up not being able to find an agreement past June 30th, which is when the fiscal year ends. And so the state government shut down for a little over a month. And after that shutdown of lasting several weeks, there was finally an agreement. The legislature was called back by the governor. Remember, only the governor can call the legislature back for a special session. And as part of that agreement to end the shutdown, the governor insisted at the time that he wanted a bonding bill. Legislature agreed to that. However, things came together fairly quickly and behind closed doors. And the way the story was told to me, because this kind of predates my time in the housing world, I was actually working at the legislature in the time, is that there was no money included for housing. Advocates couldn't kind of come together on a unified ask and decide what was needed at the time. So after that, the commissioner at the time of Minnesota Housing and several organizations, advocacy organizations, including the Coalition for the Homeless, came together and said, we as advocates who advocate for people experiencing homelessness and the services they need, along with the developers of affordable housing, we kind of need to come together and have a unified ask. And so that's when Homes for All was created. So this is sort of the timeline. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned a bit ago that 2012 was actually the first legislative session that we had a request for housing infrastructure bonds. So the even numbered years at the legislature are typically bonding years, although you will see based on this timeline that there are bonding bills passed in odd numbered years, sort of depending upon the situation at the time. You'll also note that special sessions, while they're supposed to be special and infrequent, kind of by definition, are happening more and more often, which makes them much less special for those of us who hang around there. So thus far in 2020, because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, we've actually, by next month, we will have had 7 special sessions this year, which I don't believe happened. And I'll use the word unprecedented again, because I'm sure you all have not heard the word unprecedented enough this year. I will note that we've been, as a coalition and as a movement, pretty successful over the years. You know, I think prior to 2012, the most that's ever in a bonding bill for housing was, you know, maybe up to 10 million. Most of that was general obligation bonds. There was a different instrument prior to housing infrastructure bonds that we used, but, you know, this has kind of become the thing. And we've had some success in kind of raising the bar and kind of setting a new level of expectations in terms of how much we ask for and how much we get every year. And that's in large part because of the advocacy that's been done in the partnership with the agency and the governor's office in making this a priority. You'll see also where we've added a couple of uses over the past few years. So in 2018, we added manufactured home park infrastructure as an eligible use. That year, the Senate chair of bonding asked that we set aside $30 million for permanent supportive housing for people with behavioral health needs. And then in 2020, there was a new use for single family development, which we're currently talking about how we can implement that. So, you know, really the only year that we should have had something happen and didn't was in 2016, where, you know, the things were coming together in a flurry at the end. It was a shorter session, and they just couldn't pass the bill in time. You know, for those who are around at that time, you may remember the House page literally sprinting with the bill in his hand across the street at close to midnight so the Senate could pass the bill, and they just couldn't make it happen. And they adjourned without a bonding bill that year. So, which is in part why we were able to get one passed in 2017, which we normally wouldn't do. So, you know, I would imagine in 2021, even though we were more successful than we've ever been in 2020, we will probably have another ask for housing infrastructure bonds. I would guess that bonding will be part of the mix, you know, as we go through that legislative session. And so I hope advocates are thinking and talking about it, because we certainly are at the agency and with the governor's office. So with that, I will pass it over to, I think, William, you're next, right? And he'll tell you how this all happens.
Thank you, Dan, and good morning to everyone. My name is William Price, and I am the Housing Infrastructure Bond HIB Program Manager here at Minnesota Housing in our multifamily division. And I'm very excited to share with you some of the inner workings of how we really take the resources and bonding allocation that Dan so graciously goes to the Capitol and lobbies for, and really use that to create a new permanent supportive housing across the state. So one of the most beneficial utilities of HIBs is the flexibility in how it can be structured to finance a project. And I really think that was really built into the baseline genesis of the program, to be able to fund, as Dan's mentioned, varying different sources and projects across the state. So here's a chart that really highlights those two different ways that the housing can be structured. So the housing infrastructure bonds, once we receive the authority from the legislature, it can be either paired with low-income housing tax credits, or it can be on its own. And what we call that is an HIB-only loan, meaning that the tax credits are not necessarily involved in the capital financing of the project. So what you see here on the left is a kind of a boilerplate example of the capital stack that you may see on a permanent supportive housing project. So you have your HIB loan at around $6 million. You have your tax credit syndication proceeds utilizing 4% credits at $3 million. Typically, many projects have other soft funding sources from the county or the city. That's at around $2 million, equating to total development costs of $11 million. And on the right-hand side, what you'll see is a structure where tax credits are not involved in the process. And what we do is we have the ability to increase the HIB loan to offset the omission of the 4% tax credits. So you'll see the HIB loan increase to 9 million, soft funding sources are still in the project, and the total development costs are at $11 million. So why is this flexibility and structuring important? And there are some key points that I really want to make with that, specifically when it comes to permanent supportive housing addressing homelessness across the state. Next slide, please. So one of the primary benefits of this flexibility is that when the project applies to Minnesota Housing, we have underwriters who go through the fine details of the financing structure and really recommend the most optimal structure that will fit the project. And there are a lot of variables that go into defining the optimal structure. But we've been structuring these projects since 2012, so we really have a good sense of what we're looking at and what type of project really fits into the most optimal bucket to create a project that can get closed and get in the ground and start serving homeless populations as soon as possible. One of the primary benefits is that some projects do not generate enough tax credit syndication equity to really justify using 4% credits. We also have to acknowledge that the 4% credits and accessing those credits have a cost. So if a project is not generating enough tax credit equity to substantially offset the cost of actually getting those credits, they may have a difficult time filling out their overall gap and actually getting to closing. So some examples of projects that may not be able to generate enough tax credit equity are some projects that are less than 30 units. Sometimes projects in greater Minnesota, especially supportive housing projects, may have a difficult time receiving competitive investor pricing to the point that they're able to substantially bring in enough equity into the project to kind of offset the cost as well. That is not always the case. But we have certainly seen that in some cases where an investor may price a workforce project at around 95 cents per credit, and a supportive housing project may be in the 80s. So that's always what we're weighing too in terms of looking at the tax credit versus the HIB loan only structure. And also tax credits can be very complicated. So when we receive applications from nonprofit sponsors who may be new to development, we're taking into account that when you take out the tax credits in the project, you're looking at potentially a much cleaner process. And also that may lead to a quicker closing. So you're taking out communication with the investor. Minnesota Housing is really the principal driver in the process, construction draws, reviews. So it really kind of funnels the review process to Minnesota Housing and allows us to really kind of take the lead. And again, it could potentially lead to a quicker closing. And finally, the flexibility really allows us to stretch resources across the state, acknowledging that we receive a set amount of bonding authority from the legislature. We also have a volume cap in terms of volume limited taxes and bonds across the state as well. So this flexibility allows us to ensure that we're meeting multiple needs across the state, but also allows us to target as many supportive housing projects as possible when they apply through the consolidated RFP. Next slide, please. So since housing infrastructure bonds are required to meet certain federal and state bonding rules, there are some differences in terms of what costs can be specifically paid for with the proceeds of housing infrastructure bonds. So when you're putting an application together, we have what's called a bond test analysis. And what that does is it really gives you a clear line of demarcation that lets you know, okay, these are my development costs. Which ones will be eligible to be paid for by HIB proceeds and which ones are not eligible. And so when you look at eligible costs, usually your larger costs, such as your construction costs, your developer fee, even your acquisition fees, those substantial costs are usually all eligible costs. So when you reach the closing table, we're able to use the housing infrastructure bonds to pay for those costs. There are certain circumstances where your developer fee or your acquisition fees may not be able to be paid for with HIBs. Once you get to that particular point of the process, our underwriting team or even myself can certainly walk you through the complexities of that. It's not always the case, but we can certainly walk you through those certain circumstances so you can navigate those. In terms of ineligible costs, certainly wanted to highlight that all of your project reserves are not able to be paid for with HIB proceeds. So your operating reserves, your lease-up reserves, and any other reserves that you have that are included in the project. So those costs can't be paid for with HIBs. Some financing costs, but also specifically your supportive servicing costs. Now those costs are oftentimes the part of the project where you're dealing with supportive housing, where you may come to the table and you really want to say, okay, how can I actually get these costs funded? So if you're talking about your front desk costs, your targeted case management, costs that you would normally see in your supportive services budget, those costs aren't eligible to be paid for with HIBs. Now that can certainly present some limitations, and projects that we've been funding since 2012 have had to navigate that space. But we have to acknowledge that HIBs are targeted to specifically address capital costs. And next slide, please. So since the initial authorization of HIBs in 2012, we have funded 31 projects that are wholly dedicated to serving permanent supportive housing households. We have created and or preserved over 1,600 units of permanent supportive housing across the state, and have utilized over $207 million in HIB resources. If you looked at the previous slides that Dan proposed in terms of the past 2 years have been substantial increases, 60 million, also 100 million in this past year in terms of HIB allocation resources from the legislature. So over the past 2 years, we have utilized $90 million of HIB resources and created or preserved specifically 568 units of permanent supportive housing across the state. And next slide, please. So for the next 3 slides, I really wanted to highlight, this is a comprehensive list of all of the permanent supportive housing projects that we have funded since 2012. And I wanted to go through and just highlight a couple of projects and really hone in on some of the agency, but also statewide priorities in terms of addressing homelessness and addressing supportive housing needs across the state that we've been able to really target. One of the reasons why, as a state, we've been able to make such a significant dent in the number of, and in reducing the number of homeless veterans, were some of the early projects that were funded utilizing HIB resources, specifically 2013 to 2014. Here you see Upper Post Fort Snelling, which was the early project that we funded in Minneapolis, Linden Grove in St. Cloud, and also Veterans East in Minneapolis. Combining all 3 of those projects, that's almost 200 units of permanent supportive housing specifically targeting veterans that we funded within the first 3 years of the creation of the HIB program. With HIBs, we've also been able to make substantial inroads in addressing youth homelessness. Prior Crossing was 44 units of youth targeted project in St. Paul. And also Gage East was 55 units targeting youth in Rochester. Next slide, please. Also targeting youth, HIBs were used to fund 66 West, a project in Edina, which really had a lot of community support of addressing youth homelessness in that area. And also HIBs can be used to target those really large supportive housing projects, specifically Dorothy Day, 177 units of permanent supportive housing in St. Paul next to the Navigation Center, and that project utilizing tax credits as well. Also wanted to highlight Garfield Square, which was a project in Duluth, 50 new units of permanent supportive housing, where HIBs were used to provide safe and stable housing to the former residents of the Seaway Hotel. That was a project via City Housing Corporation in Duluth, and that was funded in 2017. And next slide, please. So over the past 2 years, there has been really a key focus in addressing the unsheltered homelessness problems in the metro, with substantial investments in the core cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. But I would really like to highlight 2 specific cases where HIBs have been used to rehab and preserve the existing permanent supportive housing units that we already have in stock. Emma's Place is a 13-unit project kind of around St. Paul, the Maplewood line, that we utilize an HIB-only loan. So again, kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier about sometimes HIBs can be used to target those smaller projects, where this is an example. Already existing permanent supportive housing needed extensive rehab. We were able to come in and fund that project utilizing an HIB-only loan. And also American House. Beacon Interfaith proposed this project, rehabbing existing permanent supportive housing, targeting behavioral health households in downtown St. Paul as well. So one of the great utilities about permanent supportive housing and that eligible use with HIBs built into the statute is that we can create new housing, but again, also we can preserve the existing units that we already have. So with that, I will turn it over to my teammate, Vicki Farden, to give you more information about the supportive housing application.
Great, thanks, William. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of how we actually then go through and review applications for housing infrastructure bonds. So as everyone knows, it's a very competitive process, all of our funding. People generally will apply for tax credits and deferred funding or a mix. Some will just apply for deferred funding, but all applicants need to put together a strong team to put together a competitive application that meets as many of our strategic priorities as possible. So basically those are serving households with the greatest need, lowest income for long durations with affordable rents, rental assistance, geographic choice, costs, as many costs covered when you come in for an application. The scoring priorities are outlined on our housing tax credit self-scoring worksheet. And then, as William said, we also look at balancing and utilizing as much of our funding as possible and looking across the various uses we have for HIB, that now that we have seniors and preservation and single family. So we look at all of those resources for the best fit and to maximize and create as many units as possible with all of our funding to figure out which ones fit HIB the best. So when projects are doing a supportive housing project and want to use HIB money for supportive housing, the first thing is that all the units must be eligible for HIB, so they must be serving people experiencing homelessness. And that's a very, very broad definition of homelessness, including people leaving institutions, things like that, not just our high priority homeless definition. And as Dan mentioned and William, we also had the behavioral health allocation. So those units did not have to serve homeless. They had to serve people with behavioral health needs. However, applicants still need to have a competitive application. So most people were also serving people who were experiencing homelessness, which we know there's big overlap between the two populations. And so, so then once you know, that's clear, then applicants then kind of figure out, to be competitive, how many units they want to commit to the high priority homeless restriction and units for people with disabilities. So for the pointing strategy. So then when projects are going to do high priority homeless or units for people with disabilities, we also have threshold criteria that projects have to meet. You know, we want to see a minimum number of service hours per household, and then a % of the service funding committed at the time of application. And for units for people with disabilities, developers need to work with the county or their tribal human services to figure out a plan for the population to be served, how referrals will work, how services will be provided. And then, of course, there's a number of documents, narratives, things people need to complete. Developers need to work with the county and the continuum of care early in the process to plan their project and get their input about the needs of the community. So, so once a project's make it through scoring, the top projects that we could possibly fund with the amount of money we have are then reviewed for feasibility by staff from underwriting, asset management, our architects, and our supportive housing team. All the pieces need to be in place to have a feasible plan for long-term sustainability. So for supportive housing, we look at the experience of all the partners with supportive housing. We look at the service plan. Are they following best practices and have a good sustainable plan? Are there appropriate staffing levels? Do they have a plan for front desk or security? Some people have one or the other, some have a little mix of both. We look for an on-site property management presence is important in supportive housing, and common space and community space is also something we all look at. And then office space, of course, is needed for management and service staff. And then the secured funding, service funding, and the front desk funding, usually that cannot be secured. A lot of that funding can't be secured at the time of application. So we look to see if there's a good plan to secure the remaining funding so that by the time the project is ready to open, everything's secured. There are some sources that are very reliable that we count on for a lot of supportive housing projects, such as housing support and billable Medicaid services like targeted case management, ARMS, and then the new housing stabilization service. So rents also need to be affordable for the population. So we look to see that units have rental assistance or rents are set at supportive housing levels. So then we also consult with all our partners at DHS, counties, cities, the COCs about the project feasibility. And then it goes to our selection committee at the agency, and then it goes to our board for final approval. So, and then once selected, then applicants have to go through our due diligence process in order to move forward and close on the financing, and then start construction. So that usually is about a 2-year process once a project is selected. So now I'll show you a couple of examples of a couple supportive housing projects that have been funded with HIB. So next slide. And this is just showing that it's people and housing is what supportive housing is all about. And these are some folks from New San Marco in Duluth. One of the early 100% harm reduction supportive housing projects in Minnesota. Next slide, Dan. So this is 66 West, which William mentioned, is a project for youth in Edina. It was funded in 2017. It had a lot of community support. For a project, it's in a great location, close to Southdale and library and transportation. So this is a very nice project. Next slide, please, Dan. It has 39 units for youth experiencing homelessness, aged 16 to 22. 21 are designated for long-term homeless, and 2017 was the last year that we had that eligibility. We now have the high priority homeless eligibility. So Beacon Interfaith was the developer. They partnered with Simpson Housing to provide the services. And then Common Bond is the management agent. So this is critical. We look at that partnership to be strong, to have a really good supportive housing project. We also look at then all the legs of the stool, the capital funding, the operating funding, and the service funding. So they put together those pieces for services and front desk resources, which we'll go over in a minute. And then this project is very fortunate to have project-based assistance for all of their units from the Met Council. So next slide, Dan. And this is just a quick snapshot of the capital sources. As William said, this is an example where we used 4% tax credits, HIB, and then various other local sources. As a metro project, there's several options, Met Council, Hennepin County, the city, and the city of Edina, TIF, Federal Home Loan Bank. So this is one of the more, I think, complicated or typical of a tax credit HIB deal. And then the next slide, please. And then this is the service and front desk budget. Revenues, most of these revenues, we'll say, were secured after the capital funding. So at the application process, Beacon committed their private fundraising to fill any gaps. And so they did receive a transitional living program grant, and they used some of their Homeless Youth Act from OEO for services. And then private fundraising is a big part of their budget. And then you can see the staffing. They have 3.35 FTE. They contract some services. And then the front desk is the other big cost that they have. And that's staffed nights and weekends. So that's the kind of the overall budget and general picture of 66 West. And now Sara will talk about another project.
Thanks, Vicki. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an HIB project that we selected in our 2019 RFP. This project is Mayo Wood, and as you might have guessed, it is in Rochester, Minnesota. This project was developed by Center City Housing Corporation, who has some really cool supportive housing projects in their portfolio, a couple of which William mentioned, and I think have leveraged the availability of HIB funds really well. And so Mayo Wood just had their groundbreaking, I believe, 10 days ago. So this is a rendering of what the project will look like once completed. Next slide, please. So part of the reason we wanted to highlight this project is that the design was really a community constructed concept. So it's really based on the needs that the community was seeing, and it happened to align really nicely with the behavioral health set aside that we received in 2018 to target folks with behavioral health needs. And so prior to Center City applying to Minnesota Housing for Financing, Olmsted County had gathered partners to discuss the need for a crisis stabilization center in the region, as well as permanent supportive housing for folks with behavioral health needs. And so these partners included multiple departments of Olmsted County, Center City, mental health, healthcare, housing providers, peer support specialists, elected officials, and the Region 10 Mental Health Initiative. So a broad range of folks that were getting together to talk about really what are the barriers to accessing housing for folks with behavioral health needs. And so what came of those conversations is the Southeast Regional Crisis Center, which I believe is under construction, and Mayo Wood. And so this project is 30 one-bedroom units for single adults with behavioral health concerns, many of whom have also experienced homelessness or are experiencing homelessness, have co-occurring issues and or periods of institutionalization. So Center City will be the on-site property manager once open, and Adapta is a local mental health provider that will be offering intensive on-site supportive services via a case manager, as well as a team of living skills advisors that will be available 24/7. They will also have front desk staffing 24/7 and offer workforce development support. Next slide, please. And so I don't have a fancy table like Vicki, but the capital stack on this project is much simpler than 66 West. And so this is where 66 West was, we were pairing HIB with the 4% tax credits. Mayo Wood is straight HIB with some tax increment financing from the city of Rochester, as well as a grant from the Coalition for Rochester Area Housing. Their service resources are based on the project using housing support. So all 30 units in the project will have housing support. Folks that will be living here will have a disabling condition of long duration and be eligible for housing support. So this project also received the enhanced supplemental service rate with housing support, which I believe is $700 per unit per month. And since it is not the LTH specific housing support, they won't experience the service rate cut in July 2021. And additionally, they received a grant from the Crest Region 10 Mental Health Initiative for $50,000 annually to provide services. And so as a result, this project has a pretty robust service budget, and they also plan to use housing stabilization services where appropriate. And so, as I mentioned, they'll have a primary case manager on site and a team of living skills advisors that will be on site 24/7. So this is a project we're really excited to see up and running. Thrilled that Center City was able to partner with the folks in this region to identify a real need and then create housing to specifically address that need. And because this project will be targeting folks with behavioral health needs that have experienced institutionalization and homelessness, their screening criteria will be structured to screen in folks that have had those experiences, and then structuring services appropriately for the folks that are going to be living here. And so that's what I have for you. We have 2 minutes here for questions, if anybody else has questions for us.
There was a question in the box that Dan said that he would throw over to MCH, and it was regarding community support. And the question was, what is the best way to address community support? Wondering if you have suggestions. So one of the ways that MCH builds community support is through our legislative advocacy, whether it's bringing people to the Capitol to show overall support. to our legislative priorities, including bonding for homes. It's raising awareness in the media through letters to the editor. It's talking to your legislators in your community. Some of those items that I pointed out in the slides in the opening. But I think another way to think about this is once those projects are up and running and making sure that those are successful development projects would be based on that community that the project is going to be in. And so I would really suggest that folks reach out to some of those developers who have experience doing that. I remember watching Beacon kind of move through the process with 66 West. And I think there's challenges in every community, but really building awareness that there is a need and then connecting with people are powerful ways to build that awareness. But again, MCH really isn't an expert in the development piece, but we have a bunch of people and projects in the state who are mentioned on some of these slides that do have that experience in knowing how to approach that. So I would encourage you to reach out to those organizations because every community is different. And so I think we are actually at time. And so thank you, Dan, Vicki, William, and Sara for sharing all this information about bonding, what a critical tool and powerful tool it is for us to create permanent homes for people in Minnesota. Everybody deserves a safe and dignified home. And so thank you for the work that you are doing to advance that. And thank you to all the advocates who are still here with us on this session.